right, good singing tonight. Welcome to our evening service at Faith Baptist Church. Tonight, we are going back to First Corinthians. I've been doing a series on the first 7 chapters of this book, a part of the New Testament that I haven't done here in this church, though I've done the rest of the chapters. I don't know how that happened, but we're finishing up these 7 chapters, and we're coming to chapter 7 and the first 5 verses tonight. And I'll just let you know that chapter 7 is not only a long chapter, but it has 7 different sections, which are 7 almost different subjects. And so I've got 7 messages planned on chapter 7, and then we'll be done with this series. But tonight, in the first 5 verses, Paul speaks about marriage, and I have titled it The Purpose for Marriage. Let me read these verses to you. 1 Corinthians 7 and verse 1. Now concerning the things of which you wrote to me, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. Nevertheless, because of sexual immorality, let each man have his own wife, and let each woman have her own husband. And let the husband render to his wife the affection due her, and likewise also the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. And likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Verse 5. Do not deprive one another except with consent for a time, that you may give yourselves to fasting and prayer, and come together again, so that Satan does not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. After this passage, he will talk about singleness in the next few verses we'll look at next week, and there's various reasons for a person finding themselves single in life. He'll talk about divorce, obviously, in this chapter, calling before God, what is your calling, and those kinds of subjects. So you can see in a way how they go together also. But in these verses, I title it The Purpose for Marriage because though there are many purposes for marriage, Paul does center in on a few here. Generally, people fall in love and get married, right? I mean, that's kind of universal, and that's good. I mean, I would say that ingredient for marriage needs to be there, after all, falling in love, and so you can. But, Paul will also warn us only in the Lord. In other words, as a Christian person, young man, young woman, or whoever, he'll say in verse 39 of this chapter, only in the Lord. So you don't have to fall in love with someone who's not a believer. You don't have to, and you shouldn't, as a matter of fact. And as a matter of fact, I think Paul also teaches that you don't have to marry just any Christian that comes by. that boy or that girl may not be suitable to you, may not be suitable to following the Lord as they should. And so you can fall in love, but in one way too, you can fall in love with the person that you should fall in love with and not with someone else. But love is a necessary ingredient. Also, we could list a number of other things. I think 3 things that come right out of Genesis 1 and 2. Before sin ever entered the world, when God made the first marriage with Adam and Eve, one of the first things he said was, I'm going to give you a partner. Partnership is a reason for marriage because he needed help in the garden. He actually needed help to do what he was doing. I'm making a helper that's comparable to you, a help meet to you. So partnership in your life, having someone to do things with you and help you in whatever you believe your calling before God is. Companionship, because God said it's not good that man should be alone or woman should be alone, mankind at that point. And so singleness is a calling from God and is an exalted position too. But companionship is a reason to get married, so that you have a companion, someone to live with and be with. And then reproduction, of course. God made them male and female and said, multiply, fill the earth, and subdue it. And so that's the way humanity keeps going. That's the way from one couple in the Garden of Eden, the whole world has been populated. So that's a reason. I would add to it, and you probably could too, I put the word balance down. Whether you understand it or not, when you first get married, especially as young people, we all need some balance in our lives. And usually what happens is a man and a woman balance each other. I mean, you have certain gifts and you have strengths and weaknesses. And what happens then is that you find that balance between two people, and you combine two unique people into one unique family or marriage. Protection. Obviously, when we think about a young woman, you marry your daughter off to some guy, you want him to protect her, But the other way around, too. In other words, not only physical protection, but emotional protection, spiritual protection, all of the ways that we need someone to watch over us and help us and protect us. Marriage is for that. And the last word I put down here is, I think marriage is fun. That's what I think it's fun. I've had fun being married. I don't know about the one I'm married to, but I think she did. We just like each other, and we like to travel. We like to do things together. So marriage is fun if you, number one, love each other, of course. Number two, admire one another for what God has given you. If you can forgive one another when things, are a little rough between you, when you can laugh at and with each other, that's fun, and you can just enjoy it. And in my opinion, marriage is fun. So there are purposes to be married. Now, Paul's going to bring up a few here. I have three, but if you look at kind of the introductory statements here, he says in verse 1, now concerning the things which you wrote to me, and then he begins this statement. In other words, there are a couple indications in this book that Paul had received letters, no doubt, from Corinth about some difficulties going on in the church. You remember chapter 1 and verse 11, it has been declared to me concerning you, my brethren, from the house of Chloe, from her household, that there are contentions among you. So he found out that there were these divisions in the church by a letter that he got. Well, at the end of the book, chapter 16 and verse 17, I'm glad about the comings of Stephanas, Fortunatus, and Achaicus, for what was lacking on your part, they supplied, and they refreshed my spirit and yours, and therefore acknowledge them. So it may be that in some of this communication, part of the concern was, we don't understand marriage, and there's a lot of problems about what is marriage and what should Christians do. And imagine that. In the Roman Empire, in the Roman culture, in the Greek culture, there's never been a Christian culture at this point. And as Christianity goes into the world in different places, there's all kinds of mixed up ideas about family and marriage and reproduction and all of that. And so the world was morally corrupt. You had that kind of culture going on. In those pagan cultures, I hate to use the word values. When we don't want to say morality, we use the word values. Everybody's got their values, so to speak. But there was polygamy rampant, of course. Concubinage, in other words, people had not only multiple wives, but other concubines and things like that. Homosexuality, of course, was rampant. Transvestism was rampant in the Roman Empire. Women soldiers and hunters and athletes and all kinds of things like that was hard on the family. And it could be that they said, Apostle Paul, please help us with these kinds of things. We need to know what we need to do. Christianity exalted marriage. Christianity brought marriage up to a level that it hadn't seen in a long, long time, if it ever was like that in Israel, but at least with Christianity it did. This is the way God made us. God made us to be with one another, made us for marriage, and it fulfills unique purposes in life. So if you look at the three things that I've given you in your outline on the screen or in your bulletin, here are things that I take from these verses, these first 5 verses. Number 1, to avoid immorality. So again, back to verse 1, concerning the things of which you wrote to me, he says, first, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. not to have any sexual relationships with her. Nevertheless, because of sexual immorality, then let each man have a wife and each wife have a husband. Now, when he says it's good not to touch a woman, this is kind of a euphemism for not being unfaithful, not having sexual immorality. For example, all the way back in the book of Proverbs, it says, "So he that goeth to his neighbor's wife, whosoever toucheth her shall not be innocent." So that sexual relationship was called touching her. In the book of Ruth, remember when Ruth had to be very careful about, the workers and things in the field. And Boaz says to her, "Let your eyes be on the field, and do not that they do not reap. Go after them, for I have charged the young men that they should not touch you." So they are commanded not to, to be careful around Ruth. And one more in Genesis 20, God, you remember Abraham and Sarah went down to where Abimelech was, and Abimelech thought she was a single, a single girl. But God said to Abimelech, "I know that thou didst this thing in the integrity of thy heart, for I also withheld thee from sinning against me. Therefore suffered I thee not to touch her." And so when we have this expression, it's a euphemism. It's a nice way of saying don't have sexual immorality or sexual relations with someone you're not supposed to have. Well, he says that that's good. And he'll come back to the subject of singleness, which we'll look at next Sunday night, because there's a gift from God, and there's a single life that can be very fulfilling and very good. As a matter of fact, I want to emphasize that he doesn't exalt marriage over singleness. He doesn't exalt singleness over marriage necessarily. What God has given you and what God has called you to is what God has done for you. But singleness is good. In other words, I say here, chastity is good. If you're single and that's the way you live, that's fine. That's good. And if you are widowed, singleness and chastity is right and is good. And even divorced, as he will talk about. You find yourself in one of those situations, you should live a chaste and pure life. And I would even add that even as a married person, you should be a chaste person in the sense that you have one partner, not two and not many, and you have one desire in your life and not many. And so, in 1 Timothy chapter 3, the requirements for a pastor or for deacon is to be a one-woman man. That is, you're not supposed to have eyes for everybody else's wife or every other woman that goes by. You're supposed to have eyes for one. And then when in chapter 5, when he describes the widows, it's just the reverse. They're to be a one-man woman, a one-man woman. And so even as a married person, you're supposed to have eyes for that person you're married to and not for everybody else. So in that sense, that kind of chastity is good too. There have been great single women missionaries. And you may have been in a church that support them. I have. We don't right now in our church, but I know quite a few, and they're great people, just great women. As a matter of fact, a girl that I knew in the youth group where I kind of found the Lord, and back in the home church where I grew up, and it was a bunch of kids, we grew up together. And she became a single missionary and was for 50 years. And now she's retired and back home. I see her on Facebook and everything. Great thing. Just think, somebody that goes off and serves the Lord like that for all of that time. Again, not better, not worse, but to avoid sexual immorality, then you should get married if you have to. So notice, secondly, I borrowed this phrase, of course, from Hebrews 13, that the marriage bed then is undefiled for you. So he says, nevertheless, because of sexual immorality, and it was rampant in that world at that time, let each man have his own wife, let each woman have her own husband. There's a danger in singleness. There's a danger in living alone. And that is, of course, the temptation to this kinds of thing. The word here is porneia, and if you have the King James, they just use the word fornication, which is a common biblical translation of it. Or if you have the New King James, it's just translated immorality. So to avoid the obvious immorality, if you can't handle the single life and you can't handle living that way, then get married and satisfy that need that you have in a proper way. So marriage sanctifies the sexual union only between a man and a woman. God made marriage for one man and one woman. So that verse in Hebrews 13 says, marriage is honorable in all, and the bed undefiled. Whoremongers and adulterers God will judge. So he sanctifies the idea of marriage when that needs to be. Now, notice verse 7, and we'll get to this next week. I wish that all men were even as I myself, because Paul was single at this time, but each one has his own gift from God, one in this manner and one in another. In other words, you might have the gift from God to be able to live a single life, and there's nothing wrong with that. As a matter of fact, you're in good company. The Lord himself, the Apostle Paul, and men like that. But then notice verse 9, but if they cannot exercise self-control, let them marry. It's better to marry than to burn with passion. It's better to marry than to have those kinds of problems. So again, back in verse 2, nevertheless, to avoid that, then get married. Or I might say, get remarried. Because, of course, the Bible says for widows and widowers, there's nothing wrong with marrying again and enjoying that same relationship again. And we have that among us and always will have, and that's a good thing. Or if a person remains single, here's the instructions in remaining single for that reason. So, number one reason to get married is to avoid immorality. And everyone has to make that decision for themselves, whether a young person who's single, never been married, whether a person is widowed or widower and married again, or even divorced in a proper way, which we'll talk about later in the chapter. If remarriage is what needs to happen, then do. All right. Now, number 2, verses 3 and 4, a second reason for marriage or purpose for marriage, I call it to keep the marriage covenant. Let's read these 2 verses, verse 3 and 4. Let the husband render to his wife the affection due her, and likewise also the wife to her husband. In other words, the same thing, back and forth. And then verse 4, the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. But notice just the opposite. And likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. And so I see here this writing specifically now to the married couple, to the husband and the wife, and reminding them that you made a covenant with one another. You made a covenant to belong to one another, and a covenant is a commitment, and it involves fidelity to one another, and you belong to one another. So in 2 ways to describe this, how you belong to one another, I put down here the husband's role and the wife's role, but it's almost exactly the same thing as we read in these 2 verses. So in my outline here, I have the husband's role. Number 1, verse 3, affection due her, and number 2, you have authority over her. But when I wrote down my outline under the wife, I have verse 3, affection due him, and secondly, authority over him. And so it's kind of, again, back and forth because in marriage, you're equals. The husband is the head of the wife. We understand that. But what I'm saying is you're 2 human beings, 2 children of God, 2 equal souls that have come together to have a marriage with one another. And so there's certain reciprocal responsibilities back and forth. And so it may have been, some writers suppose, that in this communication that Paul got about the church, that he was notified of a problem that seems to have been common in those days, and that is that even among believers, there were people who said, even if you're married, it's far more spiritual not to have sexual relationship even with your wife, because that means you're on a higher spiritual level. Or if you're a wife and you want to have that high spiritual level, not to have relations with your husband. And there was evidently that kind of thought going around, because, folks, if people get away from scriptural language, you can come up with all kinds of weird ideas of what to do and what you're thinking. And if that's true, and that was one of them, what he's reminding the husband and the wife is sexual relationship is part of marriage, and you owe that to one another, because that's one of the reasons you got married, and that's one of the reasons to avoid immorality. You got married for this reason. So there may be reasons to abstain for a while, but a husband and wife doesn't abstain for very long, and that's right. So the affection due her, or to her, he says, the affection due him. I suppose there can be abuses in this, but I think by far we're just talking about the things that we understand, the normal attraction and consent that we have between a husband and a wife. Now, secondly, in verse 4, the authority is a little bit different. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. And likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. So this authority over means you belong to her. She belongs to him. And therefore, that authority over the use of your sexual purposes in your body belong to that person. And that person, therefore, has authority over that other person and is not to be used in any other way. So that's quite an authority, when you render each other due benevolence, but you also realize that there's a certain authority there. Let me put it this way. In the Old Testament, sexual immorality is described as discovering someone's nakedness. When you discover someone's nakedness, that's immoral. So when God made Adam and Eve, before sin entered into the world, the last verse of chapter 1 in Genesis says, they were both naked, the husband and his wife, and were not ashamed. Because in that sense, the husband and the wife have authority with one another and over one another, but no one else enters into that, quote, nakedness without it being immoral. And that's, if you want to go to Leviticus chapter 18 to the holiness code of the Old Testament, you can read a long list of those kinds of things. So that belongs to the wife and to the husband. And so the wife has authority over the husband's body for that reason, and vice versa. Now, your body belongs to, number one, to God. And after that, your body belongs to yourself. And after that, your body belongs to your spouse and no one else in this world. Immodesty and suggestiveness and forwardness with another person becomes sin. That kind of thing should be reserved for one another. And yet, folks, our world, like their world, is full of immodesty, suggestiveness, and forwardness by people in this society in which we live in. And if those things happen toward anyone who you're not married to or not married to you, then 3 sins are being committed here. Number one, you've been immodest. And I'm speaking to men or women. You've been immodest and caused someone to have thoughts and suggestions that they should not have had toward you. Number 2, you may be making a brother or sister stumble. And if you make that brother lust after you when he shouldn't be doing that, or that woman lust after you when she shouldn't be doing that, then you've caused a brother or sister in Christ to stumble, or anyone else to stumble for that matter. And then the person who lusted after that person has committed the sin of lust. And so to go outside the marriage in these relationships always brings sinfulness and always brings confusion. You know what, I read as I finished this last month, I've been trying to read through Proverbs, and in Proverbs 30, this last week, I was reading it in Proverbs 30. There's a whole list of these things where the writer says, there are three things that are wonderful to me, and fourth is, so here's the way one of them put it in Proverbs 30, 18 to 20. There are three things which are too wonderful for me. Yes, four which I do not understand. Number one, the way of an eagle in the air. I'd like to talk about that because that's a wonderful thing. We saw an eagle sitting out on the ice outside where we were ice fishing as a beggar. He's literally standing there outside the tent waiting for you to throw the fish out the door. And he got some too. The way of an eagle in the air, the way of a serpent on a rock, and the way of a ship in the midst of the sea. The writer says these things, they're wonderful to watch. I don't understand it. But then he says, and the way of a man with his virgin, or meaning his wife. The way of a man and a wife together. God just made us this way, and in the proper relationship, in the proper place, it is a wonderful thing too. By the way, the very next verse, before that list is over, but there is the way of the adulterous woman. She eats and wipes her mouth and says, I've done no wickedness. So you see the difference between what's proper and what's not. So the second purpose, I think, for marriage is to keep the marriage covenant between a husband and wife. Thirdly, in verse 5, I call it to honor your faith. To be able to walk with the Lord and what he's called you to do and have the kind of faith that he wants you to have. So notice in verse 5, do not deprive one another except with consent for a time, that you may give yourselves to fasting and prayer. And then, secondly, he says, and come together again so that Satan does not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. Glance back up above to chapter 6 and verse 29, and notice how he, there is no chapter 20, verse 29, is there? So go back up to where I want to go. I'm sorry, I do want to go chapter 7, verse 29. I wanted to go back to chapter 6 and verse 18, flee sexual immorality, when we were talking about the last point. But here, when we get to chapter 7 to verse 29, he's going to say this. This I say, brethren, the time is short, so that from now on, even those who have wives should be as those who had none. That sounds strange to say after everything else he said. And those who weep as though they did not weep, and those who rejoice as though they did not rejoice, and those who buy as though they did not possess, and those who use this world as not misusing it, for the form of this world is passing away. What does he mean by that kind of language? He means that in this world in which we live, sometimes it's necessary for you to do the harder thing or the difficult thing or the thing that takes you away from other purposes in order to serve the Lord. And they were entering into a time here in the first century of persecution. There's a time when you have to flee. There's a time when you have to separate from one another for protection. There is a time when you just have to do the right thing, and sometimes it interrupts your married life, your family life, your time, and everything else. Well, that's always true for all of us. So whether single or married, there are just temporary roles that maybe you need to accomplish in your life. So notice that he mentions specifically here, of course, in verse 5, the fasting and the prayer. Now he says, and I can see this, that a husband and wife might say, suppose they both agreed, we're going to fast for 3 days. We're going to fast for 5 days or something like that, if you can do that. And they decide to do that. Probably the abstention from sexual relationship was part of that fasting. And so we're giving ourselves to prayer and fasting for a certain amount of time. You both consent to it. You both say that that's fine. Notice, except with consent for a time, so that you can give yourselves to a spiritual endeavor that is good to do. So the things that he's been telling us, this is good for you, husband and wife. This is good for you to live together this way, but you may want to stop for a time for another good purpose, and that is to serve God in a certain way. So prayer and fasting is one way. And you know what? I think there are other ways that this can be applied, some in short spurts and some in longer. For example, a husband and wife living in the same home give each other time to have their own personal devotions, right? And you know that if you've been in that relationship. So there are just times that she needs to get away by herself and be able to read her Bible and to pray without you just asking her and nagging her about everything that's going on in the house. And there's sometimes when he needs to just get away and read his Bible and have his devotion time. Well, that doesn't take very long. I mean, it doesn't take days, but that kind of thing, a husband and wife, you give to one another. You say, you need this time with the Lord. I need this time with the Lord. And so maybe you have different times of the day. You know, you're a night owl and he's a early bird and whatever. And so you have those kinds of times maybe. You know, sometimes you are involved in serving other people. I think, ladies, you do this a lot with maybe you have some kind of a card ministry, a calling ministry, a visitation ministry. Maybe you bake and cook and take things to people, and it takes time, and you have to be away for a while to do that kind of thing. I think time in church is a way too. You know, you're sitting here in church tonight. It's a Sunday night in January. And you could say, well, we need to have family time, so we're staying home tonight. Well, that may be now and then, but I kind of, as a pastor, am feeling like we're only asking 3 hours a week. You need those time for family times too, and there's no better family time for you and your wife and even for kids than to be in church when the doors are open. That's family time too. But I'm saying, so we're here doing a different thing. We're here doing a spiritual thing. We're here doing something that is commanded of us, that is profitable to us, but it takes you away from your time at home. There's no doubt about that. Travel time and getting ready and all that it does. You know what? Beyond that, there's certain kind of missionary activities. I think many of you, if not all of you, have been in some kind of mission trip or mission activity somewhere that took you away for a week. I'm involved in that all the time still, and Ann's probably glad when it comes up, and go ahead and go, But I mean, I'll go somewhere and teach a module for a week. I'll go work at a camp for a week. You're gone for that amount of time, so you're apart. So consent for a time, and actually, that's kind of good for both of you. If you're the one left at home, you have quiet time. You have good time by yourself. If you're traveling, I talk to the Lord a lot behind the steering wheel of a car, and it's a nice time. I kind of enjoy it. Now, beyond that, there are times of conflict in a marriage, and there are times when conflict between a husband and wife brings them apart when they really shouldn't be apart. But when those times, and if those times happen, then counseling needs to be there, some kind of help, some kind of fixing of that problem that drew you apart so that you come back together again. So if your times together have been separated because of conflict, be sure that those are taken care of in a proper way so that you come back together. All right, so I have number one, the love of service, but he ends our verse with a fear of the adversary, whom he names as Satan here. So again, he'll say in the second half of verse 5, and come together again so that Satan does not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. Come together again. There's a time frame agreed upon. You work out the problems. You come back together because Satan would love to tempt you. In other words, in this time of separation, you are vulnerable. You're away from your wife. You're away from your husband. You're tempted by other things that could be out there, and this world is full of temptation. And so you're vulnerable during those times. You need to know that, and you need to protect yourself from it and help protect one another from it. But the point he's making here is Satan knows that. Satan knows how we're made. Satan knows your Achilles heel. Satan knows our weaknesses. He knows what our fallen human nature really is. And so he, at these times, may come and his demons toward a believer specifically. Let me just quickly read 2 Corinthians 2:11. Lest Satan should take advantage of us, for we are not ignorant of his devices. He's got those out there too. 2 Timothy 2:26, that they may come to their senses and escape the snare of the devil, having been taken captive by him at his will. And one other is 1 Peter 5:8 and 9. Be sober, be vigilant, because your adversary, the devil, walks about like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. Resist him, steadfast in the faith, knowing that the same sufferings are experienced by your brotherhood in the world. It's a common problem among people. So be aware that Satan loves to get you in a weak time, get you in a compromising situation, get you somewhere where he might be able to pull you away from the life that you're supposed to have. Okay, so I call this, thirdly, in verse 5, one reason to be married is to honor your faith in serving God and resisting this world together. Let me just end with these words. The world is not a friend of grace. The Roman world was not, the Greek world was not, the Russian world is not, the American world is not, or neither other culture in this world is not a friend of grace. Your life serving the Lord, you're not going to necessarily find it easy in this world. It's going to be harder, and you need to understand the dangers that go on in this world. And it is not good that man should be alone, God said. And that's the purpose for marriage. It's not good that you should be alone. Now, we're going to come back next week and say, yet it may be good for you to be alone if God has gifted you in a certain way or called you to that singleness. And by the way, those of you who are sitting here as widows or widowers before me, for this time anyway, God has called you to this. For this time, that's where you are, because this is the way God has worked out your life. One of you had to go to heaven before the other, and that leaves a person single. And so you fall into that category. But it's generally not good to be alone, and that's why we marry. So God's answer to that was marriage. God's answer to that, I'll make a helper comparable to you. And Adam looked at her and said, this is now bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. A man shall leave his father and mother and cleave unto his wife, and they shall be one flesh. That's what he realized. And so, as the old title goes, it's a wonderful life. It's a wonderful life to find that special person and live with that special person in this world. That's what he's telling us here. We'll go on with those kind of subjects. It's a great chapter and full of a lot of good admonitions that way. All right, stand with me. We will pray and we will sing a song together. Father, thank you for reminding us of these kinds of things in your word. we realize that the Bible's not just a list of do's and don'ts, but it surely is a letter of your love to us and your admonition to us and your explanations to us of who we are and how we live and how we should handle that. So as we learn that even tonight and go through this chapter and these kind of subjects, help us, Father, then to be stronger, to be more committed to one another, to be committed to our faith, and to serving you in this world in which we live until you call us home. And we'll thank you for these blessings in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, Kent's going to come and lead us in the song.